Welcome everyone, and how are you all doing? This is Coursera's class, Masterclass, YouTube Masterclass. And it's coming on later today or later tomorrow for us to teach you a little lesson about film studies. And it's a big lesson about film studies. And we've been doing this class for about 5 years now. We were going to start on January 3rd, but we'd started today instead. And it will be on the history of silent film, and we are doing classes for USC, California Institute of the Arts, and we're also doing classes for Harvard. So these are the three schools we're teaching for, and we're doing the history of silent film. So we've talked a lot about different film movements and film genres, and there's film get-togethers, all around the world where people important meet, and then they see an important film, and by important film we mean big name director, big named writer or star. And I think every country uses that, but especially with Hollywood in America, they really use the big name directors, big name writers, big name stars, and then they put the packages together. And a package is actually everything from the script, the pre-production, like the script, the production, the filming, and the post-production, which comes after it's all done. And then the post-production is where they fulfill their making the editing process, and the sound editing, and all the editing. So what is editing really? It's where you take a piece of film that you've already filmed or a piece of digital video that you've already recorded, and you put it with another digital video recording, and the two digital video recordings link up, and then pretty soon you've got a whole movie, because you've got a whole chain of these digital video clips that you're making each one into a longer chain into one long video that is going to be used as what we call a movie, because movies are now shot on the digital medium. The digital medium has been used to make it seem as though it's 24 frames a second, which is what our persistence of vision, where the pictures are moving, one picture at a time moves to the next picture as the either projector or camera rotates the picture, and it looks like it's moving normally, like we look like in real life. And of course, this is how cinema is, or digital video, or even film stock is exposed and then digitized and then made into this final project. But the thing about the early days of the silent film is that really what's scary about the history of silent film is we know a lot about it. There are movies all the way from 1895 with a train coming into a station, all the way to 1927 with The Jazz Singer. These are sort of the films that take place all over international history in terms of what started the film movement. But what's really interesting is that since it all came in at about the same time in 1895, with Train coming into a station, with the Lumiere brothers having produced the first set of movies that were shown in Paris, France, and they watched them all on this big screen, and they sort of they got together and saw these big images, and they thought they were real, and they kind of were real. And so how does this all put it into context about why film was being invented? Well, modernity was coming in. The modern world was coming in after the Renaissance and Enlightenment of the 1700s and 1800s. And then you get into the 1800s with the Restoration, and you kind of get this whole feeling that this big event of modernity is coming forward in the future of the world, and the whole world is waiting to see what modernity is going to show to them. But so there's sort of this theory that a mirror is what we're looking into when we see ourselves, for what we really look like to ourselves. And then so you take that same concept and how movement in a mirror sort of makes it seem like we're looking at a picture that's moving on its own, but really it's not. It's everything we're moving around doing. So this mirror world is coming up with these stories like Alice in Wonderland, and you have this modernity is the idea that we're projecting an image from ourselves onto the image, and that is how the image is played back to us as what we want to see ourselves. And so it's kind of this idea of a mirror already being in a camera, and that's what's going to attract the picture from what you're pointing it at and seeing the picture come in, and then it sort of starts moving because it's already moving on the mirror, so it prints onto the film stock or the digital video, whatever it is that it records. So when the Lumiere brothers first invented the cinematograph, it's like this big camera that actually is a projector too, and it's like they've been working on it for years, and it's modernity. Modernity is that projection into the mirror, that mirror world. It's like this thing that we can show in big mediums, like as big as we can get in modernity. What is it that we lost? What is it that we need? What is it that we want? What is it? And what we want is to see things reprojected on some images, and this sort of thing hadn't been ever done before until 150 years ago. And so then after 150 years, we're here now, and we still have cinema, and like Hollywood's in a different form now, and it's all been subjugated to these different like box releases and these sort of like different studios that are still functioning, but there's this different kind of function for them because it's a digital art medium, and then the digital art medium is kind of different than the modernity thing because they wanted these big, huge like walls covered with these pictures that they were projecting from the cinematograph, like of a train coming into a station. And you can only imagine that being the first film in 1895 that it's a silent film. And what that means is that like silent films from 1895 to 1927, maybe even all the way to 31, I was born but by Ozu, and the Lumieres all the way to that, is like this idea that you can make film without exactly a soundtrack. Now, at first, when they were doing that, they were building soundtrack machines, and there were record players that were coming about, but the soundtrack machines weren't exactly used yet because they weren't building them for the big screen, and like they were just building like these kind of record players, these monographs, these things that were like pushing sound out of a record that people could hear later, and then they could go back to listen to the sound. They did the same thing with picture, but they never matched the two up until years later. And there's a reason for that. One of the reasons is when they were building the cinema, they never really wanted to do the sound at first. Like they thought, with a train coming into a station, you can imagine how loud that would be, and all the people that were gathered at the place. A regular microphone that they had at that time, even if they had much in microphone availability, they wouldn't have been able to capture the crowd, the train. Like nowadays, you would film it with a microphone over everything, a hidden mic on everything. You'd put a mic on the wall. You'd put a mic on the person's that's talking and telling about the movie, and then you put a mic on the people that are standing at the station, and then you put a mic above the train, and then all these sounds would come to life. But you could see that they didn't do that in the silent era, not to save time or anything. They just didn't have a cooperative technology between the sound and picture. And that's why it's called the silent film, or silent film history, is because they had all these qualities that they put together on film, but it was a picture medium back then. It was a medium that was to display moving pictures. The idea was they invented it so they could have slide after slide of a moving picture. And so these moving pictures would then detail the sort of like movie that plays before you, and then those details are like sink into your eyes, and then you see it in your head. Our eyes actually work kind of like a camera, and the back of our mind kind of works like a film strip. And you can kind of record things into your mind by looking at it through your eyes. And like the cerebral cortex is where all the memories are stored of the pictures that we see. And the pictures that we see really define what we believe exist in the world and what that is in the world of even being. So a film camera works the same way, as it's exposing with a mirror like onto a digital film, or not digital film, but in the Lumiere's case, it was the film stock. And the film stock was like celluloid that had the halides and the emulsifiers, and everything would explode onto the film stock, and like from the mirror being lit up and passing by it 24 frames a second. And I'm sure it was a little different than that in the silent era, because it was more like either 22 frames a second or 26 frames a second, but it's usually 22 or 18 frames a second. Because they didn't have to match it with sound at the same time, for one thing. And they did actually produce like these films that had the little, the film was connected to the camera and the projector, so it could be slid through, so it could go side to side. Sometimes it's down to up, but usually not, because it would create a sense that the room is falling if it was down to up. But trust me, they had down to up, side to side. The kinetograph, all these inventions were coming about right around the era of modernity. You had the Paris Society that was studying all these different inventions of optical toys, like the zoetrope and the thaumatrope, and and they had these, and they were like these spinning rooms that like the pictures would be a little different each picture, but it was just moved slightly different, and then when they moved, it looked like the image was really moving. So this all led up to the 1895, these early pre-optical toys that they had for the cinema history, that they had for at the time to use for what they were calling cinema. And it wasn't really until the Great Train Robbery in America that they had established kind of a national cinema for how they were going to run a Hollywood show on the printed film media. And we'll get to that. We're going to get to that. There's a few things that have to be put in place. First of all, these societies that are studying optical toys, I mean, they're growing all over the world, and they're coming up with scientific ways of making these studies like happen, of making these studies rapport, like be part of history, be part of societal issues, And so the train coming into the station, you can imagine people probably thought it was a real train coming into the station, but it was a real train. They recorded a real train and then played back a real train, but I mean, they probably thought it was a train, like in terms of no film there when they saw it in this big crowd, Who knows, it was a big fair. It was like the World's Fair, And the Lumières brought it out. They also had a movie where this guy was stepping on a hose, and he wasn't letting the water run through it. And then he got off the hose, and like all of a sudden, his son's looking at the other end, and it sprays him. It's like the world's first comedy. It's like these two scenes cut together. And then there's like this scene where there's this film where like this building falls over and it kind of like stops halfway, and he like rewinds and goes back to normal. And it's like the Lumières weren't really like experimental. I mean, they were experimental inventors, but they weren't really experimental photographers so much, although they were the first photographers ever. But you look at how they're framing the photography like a regular picture camera would be, which happened in the earlier 1800s, before the 1890s. So we're thinking that like if all these images came together into realism, you'd have the Lumières, because they're just filming what's there, and they're filming what's there to make like an imprint of the world around them, or the mirror of the world around them, back onto a screen that you can then show to however many people come in and watch you and watch your films. And so they sort of got popular right away, like these societies that were building these optical toys like the zoetrope. Or the phenakistoscope, which is that one that spins around like a sunflower, and you kind of have a mirror down here and on a magnet, and it shows the pictures like down below of like this thing moving and like displaying it. Those were all the ways that they learned to make a projector and to make a film camera. So they learned that because they learned that the mirror projected onto the image the imprint when you shine a light on it, or when you shine a light and then darkness and a light and then darkness, it imprints onto film stock, or nowadays onto digital video. And so after this whole big event with the Lumières inventing cinema, which are the real inventors of cinema, were the Lumières, because they had it out first. They had the equipment out first, and then you had this whole issue that we've got to get into big time with this class. This is silent film history class, and it's like Thomas Edison. I mean, Thomas Edison was at his laboratory. He was building these, like all kinds of these inventions that were going all over the place. And not all of them worked, but some of them worked really well. And like some of them were the key inventions that we have now of it. There were a lot of inventions that he did. When he did cinema, he had this way of kind of making certain features of the cinema work that we still use today, like the focus pull and the lens cap and the bottom with the holder and the way it's shaped. And so there was a lot of impetus that Thomas Edison put into it. But Thomas Edison didn't really invent a projector yet. And he had a projector later, but he didn't really invent a projector to put it onto a wall or put it onto a screen. He just watched it through this like little monitor to see what he had recorded. And so I'm not saying that he didn't invent cinema, because in a way his camera was independent from the Lumières, and in a way his camera was all his own idea. But he didn't it wasn't really all his own idea, because pinhole cameras existed even in America, where you have these, like, you can even make those out of like cardboard boxes. You can like put a cardboard box up and then like put a little pinhole in it, and then like, put it you can make it, and then you put a piece of paper up and a light through the paper, and then the light goes through the pinhole and then projects it onto the wall, and then you can stencil over it on that side of the picture you've already drawn. So we see in ways that there's like projectors, there's cameras, there's these things in the pre-cinematic toys or pre-cinematic things that are coming about in the medium, and the whole era is coming to modernity. It's like the whole world is interconnected now. Not before film even. Like there's starting to be travel around the world a little bit, although I wonder how much of that really exists. And then there's kind of this like whole idea that like the world was expanding and needed this new invention to sort of bring all the people of the world to one mass event, And they've been doing that ever since. I mean, like in the United States, they do. Hollywood's the biggest on that. They'll bring the whole world together for this one big mass event that's like playing in the theater, or playing, and the theaters that were built later after the Great Train, not the Great Train Robbery, but the train coming into a station, were built as these sort of rooms that you'd sort of walk into and see in the dark. You'd be in the dark, and then you see the film sprayed in light onto the wall. And you just like, that's your mirror image. You're looking at your mirror image, but it's like different images coming up. So you're projecting as though you're making the film move. So, like, it seems like your mind's making the film move, but it really isn't. It's really a process that goes on in filmmaking, that they make the cinema, the projector show the film moving. So you look at the silent era, and it's like the invention of film was the Indian silent era, and that they didn't really compensate for sound yet, even though Thomas Edison had built some sound equipment already in 1895, 1894. Thomas Edison's inventions were patented by him, but a lot of times you'd get like these other inventors with him that would kind of like make these different details different with his inventions. Like they'd change the things around. They'd change where the lens goes. They'd change how the lens takes the picture. Thomas Edison did start that out. And it was his whole society that really built that. But as far as projectors go, the Lumières were the first to have the camera and the projector before he did. But like it's not really controversial, because Thomas Edison will influence Hollywood, and that will be a way bigger influence than any other filmmaker really has on the whole medium, So it doesn't, the Lumières too, like the Lumières were almost as important, but Thomas Edison, in his kind of like nihilistic, let's only make machines and like not do anything else kind of lifestyle, he was like really getting into this idea that like we could really make pictures move, And so the Lumières, when they beat him to it, it wasn't to his disadvantage, because he'd already had pictures that were moving recorded, and that was beautiful. So if you look at the sort of like beginnings of it all, with like, I was saying, there was this Great Train Robbery movie in 1908. It was Edwin Porter. It was kind of like a train coming into a station, only this time it's going in a parallel direction from a screen, not coming towards you. And since it moved along, the train moved along, and the people were like sort of having shootouts on the train, and they were sort of getting into the like different. They were getting into these like different shots in the film and editing. And editing became a big deal. It was like that kid that stepped on the hose, or the guy that steps on the hose and then it sprays the little kid in the second shot. It's like those are two shots. You take 3 shots or 4 shots, and then you can put together a scene. And you take, or more than that, it's usually like 12 shots per scene. Even in the Silent Era, it was like 8 shots per scene. And then a bunch of scenes together or a sequence. And then a bunch of and a few sequences together are the movie. And the movie didn't become really a feature film. You got to take this point really into consideration. Movies didn't really become a part of the feature film length film, and that means over 40 minutes to an hour or two. Till Birth of a Nation and Cabaret and Dante's Inferno in 1911, when it was a movie, that was like the first feature film they could find, except The Story of the Kelly Gang, which is in Australia in 1909. And these are all the very first movements of film history. And it's funny, the films move, but it's in a movement, right? And so the story of the Kelly gang, they don't have much of, because like a lot of these films died out later because they'd throw them away when they were done with them, when they were done watching them, or they kind of like put them in a file somewhere and then they never found them again, or they just kind of like burned them off. And then, not many people knew that there was preservation of the film. You get to the Great Train Robbery, and somehow they start getting into film preservation because somehow they seem to have lots of copies of that film. And then like Dante Inferno, when it's like you're watching it and it's like this hour-long movie, hour and 10-minute long movie. It's a feature film, It's got all these scenes shot in Italy where you don't know where they filmed it or how they filmed it or whose costume is what, but it looks like the bowels of hell, and that is like scary, like horror movie, but it's like made for the church because they're trying to like tell people that like hell really exists. Is this finally strange concept about like how the first feature films came about, but that was already 20 years or 15 years after the Lumieres had showed a train running into the station. And so all those films up to Great Train Robbery and even until Birth of a Nation were all short films. And then kind of like they started doing these films like Cabaret and Birth of a Nation, where everybody's doing these big films all of a sudden, and they're fully equipped with all the acting, that's like people theater stage, instead of the Lumiere where it's all realistic. Now the Lumieres had this thing called actualities, speaking of, and that's where you have this idea that like everything you're filming is exactly as you're filming it. It's like what you're looking at, what you see is what you get, and you're kind of like the actualities are not altered. Like the people coming from the factory that are running throughout the factory are not fake. They're really workers that work there. They're not like impetus. They're not like things that are put there to like, they're not like artifice. But there's an artifice certainly that exists just with the camera itself. But if you're filming actual things that are there, it's kind of like less of an artifice, more realistic. But is anything ever on a camera realistic? I mean, it's got a border to it. You don't know what's going on beyond the scenes, but you kind of get this idea with persistence of vision that you can kind of imagine what's on the other side of the scenes. And what's on the other sides of the shots, and what's on the other side of the picture, So it all comes together in these like kind of big movies that they're building for these big crowds. And the big crowds are coming because they pay like Nickelodeons. They come and they pay 5 cents and they watch like a dozen movies, and they're all these like, and then there's like Tin Pan Alley that America had where they had these like westerns, vaudeville, and they're like blowing up the film stock. But eventually there were people that believed in taking that film stock and taking the film stock and remastering it, like coating it with a certain glaze, like making it look more beautiful, like making light and color and sound in a certain way, like not sound at this point and not color at this point, but they had tinting for the film stock, so it would be like tinted yellow or tinted red in these early short films. And you can see how we call them short films as they go along before they get to the full-length films with like Birth of a Nation and Cabaret. And then those are still silent films. They don't really come into sound until The Jazz Singer, where they invented this sort of way to record sound while the picture was being recorded, or later after where they could add it to. And so, I don't really think that as far as we go as film goers and film viewers and film connoisseurs and everything, that like we really pay attention to too much about the beginning of film history, or like we don't really care so much that there were these films that came out and then they were kind of thrown out. But like when they started taking it seriously to take films and restore them and remaster them and put them back out or put them into archives and everything, and take an archive of a library and kind of put all the film stock into the archive of the library. And then they'd have the film stock showing on the screen whatever they filmed, however they changed it with the editing to scene, with the shots being placed in different orders. And in that editing, there's sort of this idea with even Edwin Porter that you get like the scene you want after the scene you shot, so that each scene follows it, and it kind of goes in this whole long span of full recordings, and the full recordings became the full placement of the display of pictures. And so the display of pictures, excuse me for 1 second. The display of pictures is what's really showing the different scenes that they recorded and then assembled together with the editing, where they took the chain events of the film stock and they sort of split it right on the line of each film stock where they wanted to connect it to the next one. And then that way you take the connectors and you connect by like looking at the picture on how it matches the other picture, even if it's in a different scenario, like if it's shot somewhere else. So you put those two scenes together. When they're shot together, they move, and then you see the projectors moving, and so then you see like a kind of a jump, but it's not a jump if you make it look like it's a seamless transition. And the difference, but like a jump cut could be a seamless transition in a way in an even more modern film that we don't get that discouragement from, because we know that the same kind of technique of editing existed even in the Edwin Porter. And so it's like, where do we go with all this? I mean, here's our class. We're talking about silent film. We're talking about early short films in the silent era. And none of them were like viewed as like short films or, in that way, because really they didn't have the features. But then really later on, when they made short film, like now, and even after the short film era of silent film, they made short films just for these like kind of ideas that come into a movie that don't take a full feature to make it. It's hard to explain why you would choose to make the short film medium unless you were in the silent era and then you had no other way. But that's really how it is in our era too, because if you have like digital film, a digital cinema, digital movies, digital video, you kind of were like, well, we're gonna make a short film too, and like we can make it out of anything we want, and we can kind of like, we don't have to, we can move the camera around. It doesn't have to be sitting on this big giant like tripod that's like stuck to the ground, and it can be like hoisted around and like dropped and rolled and scooted around, and you can do things with a film. And you'll see in the silent era, there's examples of all kinds of camera work that is even handheld camera work, like you see The Last Laugh, by Murnau, and it's kind of like they've got this scene where this guy's holding a table, he's holding this like tray with food on it, and he's coming to this cafe to give it to it, and all of a sudden he starts floating around, and he floats all through the cafe, and it's like this guy's dream sequence. Okay, Emil Jannings is having this dream sequence. It's a German film, and you're like, well, they're already, this guy that's like swinging on a camera like dolly or something is filming with a handheld big camera, this whole shot that makes no sense. It's like, I don't even know how they got everybody to fly on strings. I don't know how they necessarily do make the strings look invisible. I mean, you just edit them out, delete them out of the film, right? Just put a pencil eraser and erase them out, like they do in Duck Amuck. You just kind of like have something in the frame you don't want, you just kind of erase it, And back to the Lumières, they're shooting actualities, and they're putting it right there in front of the camera, and it's like everything you see is exactly the mirror shot of what was filmed, except it's in black and white, and they didn't really consider that the wrong way to do things, because it's not. And even now they don't, because like even with color film, you still get films that are kind of nostalgic and throwback, like Schindler's List, and they throw back to the black and white, or Ed Wood, or I'm going to get docked points for saying that, but it's like we get like black and white films are going on today even still, but not very many of them. And they're usually like these event films that are kind of like made especially, and they're supposed to be like thrown back to an era, or so they're nostalgic, and that's why, or they're art films altogether, and so they don't have this like necessarily quality of color or black and white that has to remain stable for the whole constant of the film. And so we take the end of the short film era of film history of the silent era, with Train coming into the station, to Porter's Great Train Robbery. All the films in between were interesting films. There's films that are short films from all over the world that are coming in. And really, this all over the world starts to make films that are longer already. Like Ingeborg Holm by Victor Seastrom comes out. And this is one where I'm talking about how the shots match up and create like a seamless editing. You don't really notice throughout Ingeborg Holm that there's like editing at all. You just see it seems realistic. It seems like they're at a house, they're in the garden, they're out in the forest, and it's like the camera's moving to, not even moving, it's just solid right there, and kind of like watching them do their thing, and they're kind of off screen sometimes. And I love Victor Seastrom's use of off screen space. Like you have this idea that you can't see what's going on behind the frame, and then there's sort of these things that come in to the frame, like these people would walk into the frame and then show their hand or show their whole body. There's a scene in Birth of a Nation like that where you see the lady hug her son through a door frame, and you're kind of like, well, that's weird because like that's off stage. And it's like, that's kind of theatrical. And there's one thing that cinema is, especially with Great Train Robbery, and not as much with the actualities, but still even there, is that cinema is a theatrical medium. Like, it's theatrical. That's what Thomas Edison didn't build a projector necessarily, but the theatrical medium means that everybody's going to get together and watch this big, like, modern new invention that's being played and kind of get together and see what they think of it. And then when it has drama in it, it's even more theatrical, because when the drama is like a story narrative that buckles around the story, like Ingeborg Holm, this old retired guy, is coming home to his son, and his son has to send him to chop some wood or get some wood off the ground, and then he's got to bring it back to his house. And you're like, this whole thing has a drama story narrative now, but it's a realistic one, so it's kind of like a straight line story. It's not necessarily 3-act structure. But Great Train Robbery, on the other hand, by Porter, the American film that's sort of turning on to what Hollywood's going to become, is sort of this idea that there is a chain reaction in the shots, yes, but that they skip back and forth from different scenarios during the same narrative that's overarching it. You kind of get this whole dramaturgy of like these guys these robbers on a train taking over the train, and then they're gonna sort of blow up the train, get all the money, get out of there, and then you see the guy like shooting at the screen, which is like more of a formalized technique of like revealing that you're making a film. So we know that it's a modern era thing, but now we know that we're also in a classical period of it. It's like modern classical moments, modern classical movies, modern classical music, It's like only modern because it's in the modern era. And the modern era is only there because you have like the philosophers like Descartes coming along and saying like optics are the way to like see something, and then it changes the whole meaning of how the world is seen just by you seeing it. Like once you see it, it kind of records on your cerebral cortex, and it doesn't have to be moving, but it influences your mind forever on what the thing is you see and how you see it. So, in the film era, when you're watching movies clipped together in The Great Train Robbery and everything, you really can tell it's a theatrical film, The Great Train Robbery, as opposed to train coming into a station, whereas in a theater you can see that, but it's not like the theatrics of the theater that are narrative, story-driven, and sort of connected in the events of the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and the movements, the character movement, the character dialogue. Dialogue was done as like an intertitle where you'd put the dialogue on a card and show it. That's kind of primitive style in that way. And then, of course, you have the whole PMR and the primitive mode of representation, and then the general mode of representation. Now, the primitive mode of representation is just kind of film the whole thing in one long shot and kind of have people walk around in the picture, and you film this like imprint of it, and then it's like this primitive film stock of like these people just kind of doing their own thing and being in a subway. It's kind of like watching through a surveillance camera or something. And then in general mode of reproductivity of camera work is like this more theatrical style combined with this realism style, that the realism is there not because of theatrics, but because of the necessity for the camera to get the exact picture that's filmed in the mirror world across from it. So you see that in the early days of cinema, they're already dealing with these like modern questions, like what is mankind doing to make changes on technology inventions to then release it to the public, and then say, what do you think about our technological invention is kind of a reality. It's like, that's the picture we took. That's the reality. But then in the formal technique of later Hollywood, you can kind of alter a picture here. You can alter a frame here. Even when you're editing, it's a formal technique because it's like you're altering where the scene jumps to the next scene. And it doesn't exactly jump. It kind of just scoots across. Like the film goes through the bar, and it's like it keeps looking like it's the same film. Most people that watch films, and there's nothing wrong with them at all, because everyone loves movies, don't even look at those things. They just like watch it, and it's a movie, and they don't explain it, and they just love it anyway. And I love people like that. They just don't have to say this film changes at this point, and that's why it's editing. But like even in the early silent era, they weren't like sitting there going, okay, this is why it changes, or this is why it doesn't. Like they had early critics, right, who were mostly discussing dramaturgy. And dramaturgy is like, well, this film is created because of Thomas Edison's invention. But this film is like about like these guys on a train who are shooting at each other and stealing money. And that's why when you're watching it, they're actors and it's artifice and nobody really gets killed in the shot. Now, you can't really make a movie where someone gets killed in the shot. I mean, I know that there's probably some European films where they don't have the same rules. I don't know. I don't really look for that. I don't really go searching for the film that doesn't have the same rules as all film. But one of them is that you can't really show anyone really getting killed in film, and you wouldn't want to. You wouldn't want to. It's simulated. It's simulated gunshots. It's simulated wounds. And it makes you think it's happening. So now we have another formal quality of the special effects being like, the whole film is like a special effect, really, when you're looking at the formal medium. But like the realist medium had changed from the actualities to this sort of thing where it's like neorealism later comes in the sound era and everything's exactly like it happened, but still recreated. It's recreated not in a narrative film, because that's the first time you really ran those guys through that story. So that's a little confusing and hard to figure out. But hear me out. We've got about 10 more minutes of class. So before you all get ready to asleep on this lecture, I just want you to know that the early days of film were usually given to Thomas Edison for the whole world, as though he had invented the camera first, and that was where cinema was created. It was also given to the Lumieres that they had created a film, a camera, and projector. I don't think either one of those is wrong, because they probably knew each other. These guys were all inventors. They were all like Freemason types. They were all over the world, and they all sort of put these films together and like handed them to each other and like looked at them and like saw what was going on. And they probably at the time didn't need to go for some like fame shot where it was like the only thing in the world to say that this is film, because they weren't saying they invented it, because there were all these pre-optical toys, and an optical toy is what it was for Edison at first. But then Edison sort of informing Edwin Porter, like what kind of films, the American Fireman, what kind of films to make and how to do it. And like Edwin Porter's turning around saying, Edison, this is how I'm doing it. So already you have the producer and the director kind of like arguing back and forth how they're going to make the movie. I mean, like they're not arguing, they're like telling each other what would be better for each shot. And so as the silent era progresses, you're kind of getting into this idea that there's these realistic films that are kind of disappearing, since the first few films were nothing but like these keyhole shots of everything that was happening in front of you. Now it's like later in Ingvar Holm. Now you get to these movies like later on in the 20s especially, there's formalism abounding. There's like Phantom Carriage, by Victor Seastrom. And it's like you see the carriage, this invisible carriage, come down underwater, and like Death gets out, with this scythe, and he walks up to the guy and takes him into the carriage, and they drive off, and they go on their horse's back, and they float back up from the water. You're like, how did they get that scene? Did they have the horse and buggy on I don't know, did they have it on wires and slowly set it down, and then have the water added over the top of the picture? That's probably like added a picture of water over the top of a picture of a carriage kind of like swooping in. But I don't know how they do that. They might have just been coming down a mountain and then put a picture of water over it, and it made it look like it was kind of floating down, and you don't know how but that's formalism. It's really expensive special effects, and even in European cinema or American cinema, and you see this like that handheld shot I was talking about in The Last Laugh. And so in the era of the teens, you start to have the early full-length features. So you're getting like the movies like Inferno, and Cabaret is an interesting film because it's like real long, referenced in a Fellini film, Nights in Cabaret later, and by Fellini, and that's a really cool film. It's like this modern film about this prostitute in you don't even want to know, but Cabiria is the same place, and it's like some kind of a geographic location in Italy. And they do this thing, or like some kind of phrase that means something in Italy, and like they do this thing. And I can't but play ignorant to that because it could be both. And like I see the Cabiria as being this big movie, thousands and thousands of extras, like soldiers everywhere. It's like this Spartacus kind of movie, and you get this idea that there's this big war going on, and it's chaos, and like so. This has come a long way from the Great Train Robbery, where it's just like these few guys on a train, but that's still an amazing film because of the mechanics of it and how the editing sticks together and how the train's flowing one way. But then in Cabiria, you have this kind of like mass chaos. You don't know why the camera is like floating over the crowd. It's already like an Italian realist, but now it's Italian mess. Like it's just like it's all over the place. It's like there's heads hanging on. It's like all of it's special effects. Nobody really died. It wasn't a real war, and it was totally like artifice to make it entertainment. But like this artifice to make entertainment about history, but we don't know how real the history is ever in a movie because you're worried about where you're placing the camera and placing the actors. I mean, at least sometimes the worries have to be like, I wonder how they would have looked in that era and how they would have spoken in that era. And there you get costume design, and you get kind of like you get the design of the movement of the film. You get the design of acting. You get the artifice. You get the 3-act structure. The narrative. The overarching look at it. So I don't really want to talk too much about D.W. Griffith this semester because I really don't think that we need to cover it anymore. We did a lot of coverage on it, and I'll just mention that he is one of the great directors, and he is one of those conspiracies as an author to like why he was so contradictory in some ways. But like I don't think we have any room to really look back and say, this person was wrong for making film about this. I mean, maybe we can, but only if it was outside the ethics of what we have now that you can't kill a person on screen. You can't really show people have sex on screen, I mean, you can kind of do that, you can make it look like that, but if you do that, you're kind of not doing cinema, it's doing some other medium. It's like, there's other things you're doing if you're doing that. It's like personal equation of like versus acting, because the theater invented that actual rule. Because there was this cinema in the Grand Guignol, and we'll learn more about it next time, but Lumiere and would later lead to Fouillard, and Fouillard is this guy who worked in France, and he was at the Cinémathèque and at the Grand Guignol, and at the Grand Guignol they'd have these sort of like plays that were unethical. They'd have violence in the play, or someone would die in the play, and they'd all be like, everyone that heard about it around the world was like, this sounds scary, there's really people dying in plays. I mean, most people that have plays already had the rule that you couldn't really kill anyone in a play. Because you didn't want to lose the actor, you didn't want everybody to die at the end, and then the Grand Guignol is real scary. So Fouillard is like coming to the Grand Guignol and is like, we got to take out the murder scenes of these plays, and we got to stop these from like happening because people are getting worried that like we have some unethical style. And really it was like people taken prisoner and put on death row and then put in these movies. It was really a bad idea. And then but Fouillard was like, okay, we're going to take it differently with Grand Guignol and make it look like surreal and make it look like we don't know what's going on and make it look like we can't really tell scene to scene where we're going with it, but we know that there's some overarching dynamic to the narrative. And that's because it's the narrative that drives us forward when we're watching theatricality, because we're waiting for some kind of conflict or some kind of climax or some kind of movement in action. And there's always movement in action in film. Like film is always moving in action. So as you take the Fouillard movie and you compare it to the D.W. Griffith movie, the D.W. Griffith movie is trying to be like Cabiria, right? It's like always editing, always like trying to make a point, always like trying to say, we're going to win this war, always trying to say, we got it under control, or always trying to say, that was total chaos. But we still made it into order. And then like with Fouillard, it's like this long take, these long shots, the camera's running longer while recording, and the projector's running longer when it plays back, and that just means like you have these kind of like envelope shots, like that aren't, or like, so they're still framed in the 1x1 screen in some ways, but Fouillard's a little bigger, but not by much, and that's because the classical ratio was 1x1. It was a square, almost, not a rectangle, and these are early primitive techniques. So when you discuss the primitive mode of representation, and you kind of see Fouillard, by the time you get to Fouillard, it's kind of gone, because it's like now he's filming to kind of show these scenes that are making fun of France saying like they would have killed this guy in real life in the play, but now we're going to bring this guy back from the dead in the movie because you can edit it around, and like the people are like going, well, wait, did he edit it to show that when he was alive, and then edit it to show when he died before that, or was it just all an artifice like Fouillard trying to trick us that it isn't, or is just to make fun of the Grand Guignol? And so we conclude today's first class, and thank you for checking it out, this Coursera YouTube Masterclass medium that we have here. And it's a graduate class. I just need to set up a few things, and we'll take off to next week. We'll go to next week, more history of silent film. But I'm saying that the technique of the silent era is one that we're going to look at a lot, like the different techniques of the directors. And it's a 4-unit class, and we teach 16 different classes of it. So over the next 16 weeks, we'll have these different discussions of cinema history, silent film history, and I'm just keeping D.W. Griffith a little off the plate because we talked so much about him in that class to begin with. And I know some of you are saying, well, like, oh no, here comes Aaron, he's talking about silent films again, this is kind of boring. Well, it isn't really the most interesting subject in the world. Like, it's weird because we think movies are always the most interesting things, sometimes, But, like, it's hard to look at a film from a different era because it's hard to see it as though it's a mirror, like in that modernity sense. It's hard to look through that mirror and see something that's foreign to you, or different than you, or different than you've ever thought of, and so you kind of push back from it. But a film buff is like, show me everything, show me everything, show me everything. And usually those are filmmakers too. There's some that can relate to the screen entire. And that's because of the theatricality and how the character brings you in, or the modernity of the realistic mirror. And so we'll leave it at that. We'll come back next week. And thank you for checking out Masterclass. Bye.